So hi, everybody, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. My name is Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. We're starting as punctually as we can, and we know that there are stragglers. So in the next 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, we'll have additional guests joining us, but in respect of your time and the time of our guest of honor, we're going to go ahead and begin. This is a session that I've looked forward to for some time. It works off of a piece written by Henry Sokolski, our guest of honor today. The article was published by American Purpose on June 18th, and it examines the question, are we prepared to protect and sustain our system of self-governance in times of future crises? And Henry front loads in the piece instances where of late one might want to consider this or focus on this question. Henry Sokolski is executive director of the Nonproliferation Education Center in Washington, D.C. He has worked in government, at the Pentagon, at a high level. He curates and edits and writes and publishes books and articles. I will note, underestimated, Are Not So Peaceful Nuclear Future, second edition 2 years ago, I think 2019. And then, as I like to say, Henry, near and dear to my heart, you were a contributing editor of American Purpose, and that makes you really very important and valuable to us. What we're going to do is I'm going to begin by asking a handful of questions, and then soon, in 15 minutes or less, we're going to invite all of you to get into the conversation with your comments and questions for Henry. But do read the June 18th article if you've not. Welcome, Henry, and thanks for making time. As I recall, when we set this up, today's a travel day for you, so we appreciate that greatly. We tried to run a tight ship, so hard stop, 1 p.m. Eastern. Welcome to everybody. So, Henry, the first thing I would ask is this. It's broad, but let's start broad before we narrow. Some questions are worth asking. I think that's a Henry Sokolski motto. It's part of your curious, investigative approach to work. Why this question and why now? Why did you come onto this? Why did you want to write this now? Among 10 or 20 other things, why do you think this is important?
Well, we've just gone through what we thought were historic events. 600,000 people in the United States, millions internationally, all of a sudden dropped dead from an unanticipated virus that origin unknown, all sorts of conspiratorial theories that may actually be correct. We don't know. Then we have January 6th, which, depending on your political outlook, was either just a bunch of rambunctious tourists or it was an insurrection. Take your pick. But one could imagine that these events could have gone much worse than they did. And if they had, there would be martial law. How long? I don't know. Maybe you could snuff out self-government as a proposition. Now, I had always been of the view that you studied foreign affairs to defend something. And in our case, we're fortunate enough to be able to defend the proposition that government is designed for the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I like the last point. It harks back to ancient Greece and common sense. In other words, our happiness depends on this government working. And so it seems to me that self-government needs to be very aware. Now, I have been doing lots of work on how to kill a nation. That's something I've worked on roughly since graduate school. And it used to be that the way you killed a nation was based on war theory of the 1920s. And this, Billy Mitchell, Duhay, Boomer Trenchard, it was you pulverize the population centers, the mobilization bases, military, economic, and you win if you do that quickly. Now, roughly, we have been operating under that organizing principle. And of course, nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, made that form of warfare seem like it was the thing. And anything less than that was considered lesser included. I'm not sure the new problems that we face. I mentioned, gray warfare, new generation warfare, where the battle spaces in the mind. I mentioned the diseases. I gave a talk on Dr. Strangelove's new passion, how you can use precision-guided weaponry to cause a nation to be killed. I think these things are new, and I don't think they're lesser included threats to the old war theory of 1920. And if I'm right, we need to be doing lots of things differently if we're serious about defending self-government.
So Henry, let's, but before we dive into the things that we ought to be doing, visit a little bit more history with us. You've started there. So we confronted the prospect of nuclear war. And as you note in your article, and I do it in bullet form, Eisenhower had a heart attack and Reagan was shot and JFK was assassinated. Tell us a little bit about what's to be learned from history, what is more applicable, what is less applicable, because you say that we've given plans a spin in the past. So there's probably something to be learned from previous moments and scenarios.
Well, essentially what they did in those cases, and they went back to something you recommended I watch, Designated Survivor, which is this incredible, it's a movie series you can get, I guess it was Netflix. I watched it gets more tedious over time, but the first 6 sessions are really kind of fun.
Can you explain quickly what that is?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that was done early on after the advent of nuclear weapons was to worry about how the White House might be hit with a nuclear weapon. And so they had to designate who would be president, if that occurred. And the designated survivor is a term of art for when you have the State of the Union address, one or somebody on the cabinet doesn't get to go, and they're supposed to survive if, God forbid, the Capitol gets hit. Well, so what happens with this? The Capitol gets hit, and then some poor, there's a Yiddish term, schlemazel, ends up becoming president, who really didn't anticipate it at all. And things unfold from there. But I think we ought to be aware that the ability to, sort of unplug government could now occur in ways where the rest of the country would be mostly functional. And the impact of the attack would be to the form of government more than to the body physical. And if that's correct, you don't prepare by thinking it's some lesser included version of the day after, where everything is literally obliterated physically.
Mm-hmm. So Henry, I'm not gonna. You're welcome to prioritize, but I won't even put it that way. What if you survey the domestic and international threats? What, as they say, what keeps you up at night? You already alluded to an article you wrote for us in the Zoom discussion you kindly did for us on new forms of weaponry. And one thing that was so riveting and disturbing was mini drones and their
Yes.
capacity to do a great deal of damage, including in the hands of, let's say, lesser forces and lesser powers. So speak to that, or whatever you'd like to speak to, but what keeps you awake at night?
Well, the first thing that worries me the most is the transition from war theory of the 1920s to this new generation of warfare. They always say transitions can be really messy. Well, here's one way things could be messy. What if nuclear weapons continue to spread and they get used? Now, as bad as new generation warfare may be, which is what we're describing roughly, there's worse, and it's the warfare of the 1920s, which, physically is much more damaging. So I think, there are 2.5 cheers for getting behind nuclear non-proliferation and pushing reliance on nuclear weapons amongst military scientists and practitioners further into the background. So that's the first worry. The second worry is that, let's say you pull that off, the second worry is, how are we going to be ready for this new generation of warfare? Don't count on it. Because we got our head up the old form of warfare too much, is my thinking. And some really scary things are conceivable that are beginning to actually unfold or almost happen. One of the things you referred to was a 7-minute advertisement, basically, for banning drones. Good luck. But it's quite a fascinating and thought-provoking and disturbing video, because, with something held in your hand, and if you're in close proximity, roughly within a mile, you can mate that system with facial recognition and take out an individual. And no one will be the wiser for quite a while. Now, in most countries, the plum book, or the number of people running a country, is pretty small. I think if you just spook those people without killing them, you have something. Well, think about that here. So concentrating officials in meetings and concentrating nodes of communication, nodes of logistics, concentrating wealth and the handling of wealth in certain places is really a fool's game. Now, that's what we have done. I mean, roughly the history of civilization is that of urbanization and concentration. Maybe we need to rethink that a little. Not entirely. You still want to have opera houses. That probably requires cities, but everything has to be in the cities? Really? I don't think so. One of the things COVID taught us is that there's life in Idaho, and there's life in Salt Lake, there's life in places you now want to live several months a year in. Good. I think we need to expand that recognition to kind of change the way we live a little.
So for example, and I will finish here and then open it up to the gallery, but tell us a little bit about what dispersal can look like, and B, do we actually need to do things like the State of the Union in person, or can you parcel people out to connect virtually? Tell us what's wise and what's doable in your view.
Well, I mean, the State of the Union, I don't know if you've watched them recently, but they're awful. I mean, if they stopped, it would be okay. Nobody has done a State of the Union address that's worth doing, as best I can tell. So, if they went back to what Woodrow Wilson and earlier presidents did, which is just deliver the goddamn thing in the form of a piece of paper to Congress, knowing full well no one would read it, that'd be okay by me. I'm being a little sarcastic, but I mean, what in the world? Do we need to have that address as the organizing principle for watching television in our government? I don't know. But you suggest an alternative, which is you could do it, but maybe you don't do it with everybody present there. You do it, the president could speak from anywhere. He could speak from someplace he likes, which, we've learned something about him. So that would make some sense. I think we began to see this on the Hill when they had hearings virtually, which is a terrific idea, I think. I participate in them. You're able to get witnesses from lots of different places that very easily. And I don't know how much substance suffered. Certainly the logistics were easier. I'm sure the staff has objections at some level, but having been a staffer on the Hill, that's our job, is to complain. So I don't know that just should be listened to. The other thing that we saw is people telecommuting. And as a result, they got familiar with mowing their lawn, recognizing their neighbors. And they did a number of other things that were, value added. The workloads, I don't know about you, I run an organization with several people. Productivity went up 50%. It doesn't have to be at war with doing work. It could be actually helpful. We noticed that we could even do lots of transactions that used to be classified, unclassified. Well, now unfortunately they're going back to the offices and using classification machines. Maybe that was a move backwards. I should have just stayed out of the office so they can get to those machines. So in a sense, we've been moving in this direction. I'd say more fundamentally, what you want to see is an eye towards things that we already are invested in, like, we're going to spend a lot on infrastructure. Well, maybe you should take a moment to think, will this make us more resilient against attack against central nodes or not? Should we concentrate all of the electricity on one grid that would be, quote, smart, or should it be distributed into smaller grids that can, vaguely communicate with one another if they must? Similarly, we had this whole drama with a pipeline recently, where for a week gasoline prices went up. We had the problem in Texas. How do you prevent those things? Ought to be a question when you're talking about federal infrastructure expenditures. Similarly, we're talking about antitrust. Well, maybe a feature of antitrust ought to be, I don't know if you can force it, but it'd be nice not only to break things up, but to get them to go different places. In other words, instead of having Amazon's massive headquarters here in Arlington, close to the Capitol, I don't know, what is wrong with Missouri, for God's sakes? It's, sort of in the center. We need to think about distributing the things of value, not only to be a better, to make it a tougher target for the enemy, but to make us a better democracy, to share the wealth and the power. One thing that would be terrific, Trump did it, I think, perhaps not with the best of intentions, but I don't want to impugn motives, so I won't. But, getting large bureaucracies in Washington to have to go to the field office, including the cabinet member, I might add, that would be smart. Maybe they should spend at least as much time out there as they do in Washington. Just a thought. Also, if you were virtual, the members could spend more time in their districts. Not a bad idea. So that's what it would look like. And you can see that it's not as radical as it might sound, given what we've just experienced and where we're going technologically anyway. The question is, should we do this consciously? If we did, I think you'd see the Pentagon, for example. You could break that up. I remember in 1989, they were talking about breaking up the Pentagon, building separate buildings all over the place. They didn't do that. Maybe they should. But not just to West Virginia, but across the country.
Yeah.
And then network the damn systems better with much more secure, advanced communication systems, which right now we don't have enough of a demand for. You would if you did what I'm talking about. And I think we need that for a variety of reasons.
So this gets, for me, as a listener, it becomes more interesting all the time. I said that was my last question. I'm going to indulge myself because I'm dying to ask one more question, and I promise we open up. Henry, how does one get political Washington focused on these sorts of things and movement and traction? It seems to me, and it is human nature and it's political reality, that we have these instances, the catastrophe of the attacks of 9/11, and then very soon thereafter, we're all running around saying it was ultimately a failure of imagination. But time and again, we don't really see the failure of imagination until after the catastrophe, because what you're talking about takes vision, political energy and capital, and really thoughtful planning. So if we want to move in the direction that you're advocating, how do we begin to start moving from here to there? Just begin.
Well, first, the way you've asked that question makes me think I should abandon this entirely, because you sound like you're saying something that's right. It does sound like, we're not cut out for this line of work. But on the chance that we are, here's how I would go about it. Okay, because in other words, I am skeptical of my own argument enough to think that it may be too much. But a couple of things. First, there's nothing as powerful as fashion. Fashion trumps insight every day. And if people, think it's cool to be having a second residence, if they have money somewhere else in places that previously were dismissed as flyover country, that's a start. I think in addition, if you start justifying expenditures for secure communications, for moving to regulatory systems that allow more experimentation in distributed electrical and power systems, that makes it easier to make the decision. So some of this is fashion, and therefore I like to start with the collegiate debate system. Make it a question. How should we arrange ourselves better to deal with certain forms of threats to self-government, foreign and domestic? Let people, at the collegiate level do this. I think also the Governors Association, which meets most often outside of Washington, and the legal councils, bar associations, et cetera, that meet regionally. I think this is a perfect topic to get that fashion in fashion. There are ways of talking, people who want to do the Green Deal, who want to do antitrust, who want to make for a more secure communication system, are looking for additional arguments. So in that sense, you can piggyback on people who are already doing things that are part of this. I don't know how adequate that answer is, but that I think, rather than go on and on and on, if I've shown you two different ways, it might be worth pursuing. In other words, if I couldn't figure out anything, then it's kind of sad.
But it helps a lot. And we wouldn't have been so delighted to publish you and so pleased to host you today if we didn't think that this has some policy relevance and possibility. And it seems to me that I think we're stuck in a moment where we're so often going over the same material in the same sorts of ways. We need to stretch and open up the debate. And I think that your article and this conversation does so in a very interesting, responsible sort of way. So with that,
I do have one point. One point I want to add. If you do this, whatever this is, distributing power, capital, and the logistics for various important things like energy, etc. You get one enormous strategic advantage over countries like Russia and China, which have done a lot of theorizing about new modes of warfare and done things in the new ways of war, but in fact have structured their military essentially as big rocket forces that, well, are supposed to pulverize population, political, military mobilization bases, as one did thinking forward from the 1920s. If you do what I'm describing, it really stresses that approach out. It strengthens our defense in a physical way, and it makes them more vulnerable. Because they cannot do decentralization without losing legitimacy.
Got it. And thank you, Henry. So we have a lot of material to work with and dig into. And if you have a question for Henry, raise your hand with that button, or if that doesn't work, feel free to wave. And if I miss you, my colleague, Michelle High, our managing editor, is very good in telling me whom I've overlooked. So I'm looking around, and Fritz, you have your hand up. Thank you, Michelle, for bringing that to my attention.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you showing up. I had read your article, and I actually remember most of it. I read it back when it was published, and I've been sending it around a lot. Not because I like the article. I don't like the article, because I have spent most of my academic career was writing on or teaching students about nuclear issues, and decapitation was always the big fear. But you've now added more reasons why I can't sleep at night. And so that's why I don't like the article.
Oh, okay.
Because
well,
in terms of what you've said, it is a very interesting article. People need to read it. There are a whole new set of threats, and if we're sort of locked in Cold War thinking, we may be, well, we're obviously going to miss a number of the threats. Look, there are two quick things that I'd like to ask about. One is a sort of a question for a follow-up to what Jeff had raised about getting people thinking about this, and those with money in Congress. Okay, so one question is, are there members of Congress that you particularly think are open to looking at all these different issues, decentralization and moving agencies and so on? So if there are, it'd be nice to think there are, and I'd like to know who some of them are and where their support for this. And then secondly, here's the one drawback, which I would not have thought about last year, 2 years ago, 10 years ago with decentralization. And it's this: as you move things out of DC, out of New York City, and so on, which there's great wisdom to, do you in fact possibly somewhat undermine the US government? I know it's a federal system, but in fact, if you don't have sort of a power center in DC and an economic center in New York, do you in fact lay the groundwork for independence movements? I mean, this in the past year, we've started to hear talk about, well, Texas should leave, California should leave, Montana, Wyoming, you name it.
Yeah.
There are all these ideas about they should leave. And would that in fact be a possible risk? Thank you.
Those are really two good questions. I'm glad you asked them, because I wanted to talk about that too, and now you make it easy. First, are there members, I think the short answer is referring back to the long answer I gave about fashion. Folks that want to do antitrust, folks that want to do, renewables or green deals, folks that want to do really modern communications need to have additional arguments. We can give them to them. All right. So when you find a member interested in those things, you go, so I guess I would go that route rather than simply El Doctore, top down. here's how you need to think about the whole world. You know, that's too German for us. I mean, I don't recommend that. I think that might be too hard. It's okay to do that in academia, but, you know, not in Washington is my guess. Okay, I don't know how satisfying that answer is. Again, it's the same answer I gave before. But you then are able to identify people pretty quickly. See, that it becomes much easier. Your second question is really much more important. And that is, hey, wait a minute. You claim you want to strengthen our government, but won't this weaken it? It has that potential. And I think it cuts two ways. Surely what you're describing is, you know, this idea that, you know, governors should send their, you know, reserve guardists to where they think the country should be defended. You know, I can imagine, well, you know, we're going to send people from Wyoming, not just to the border in Texas, but maybe we really need to defend Guam, you know, and then from there, God knows where. So you have that. Also, you know, each governor has tremendous power over things like voting and the healthcare system, to say nothing of the schooling. So my way of squaring that T is to take it directly on. In other words, the healthcare system in this country is hobbled, in my opinion, by having 51 health services. They're all different and they have different rules and different ways of taking data. That strikes me after this COVID thing is really nutty. If federalism should not depend on that being still held on to. Diseases go across state lines, after all, don't they? I mean, we get on planes, we drive. It's silly. So that's one thing I would strengthen. And I think with all due respect to all sides of the debate about voting and registration, you know, I'm sure there were some irregularities in a large election. There has to be, you know, if something's large and involving humans, come on. I mean, you know, so I actually am somewhat willing to listen to the Trump people, but the solution isn't to, you know, deputize everybody at a local level to do whatever they want, but just the opposite. You know, maybe you do need to have certain minimal requirements beyond what you currently have so that each county doesn't get to count their votes differently, much less each state. Okay, so in other words, by pushing the government to the field office, you could also take certain areas that federalism really has not, you know, done a great deal, done very well at, and say, well, you know, let's not do it that way. On the other hand, I do think the state should be given more authority to administer things like grants and money. I think if they want to do dumb, stupid stuff, they should choose their own dumb, stupid stuff. Why does the federal government have to tell them what dumb, stupid stuff to do? I mean, after all, the glue of most day-to-day operations in American government, I'm afraid to say it, has to do with avarice, money, as well as power. So I think there we need to let go a little more. I mean, in other words, you got to do this thoughtfully because your question is precisely the one you need to worry about. But I do think they're very clear and simple answers. Does that help?
Well, it does. I still may not sleep that well tonight, but no, actually, your point is good. And I do see, like I say, that's only something that just came recently to me after having read it. So I'll definitely incorporate what your thoughts are. Appreciate it.
Right.
Good, Fritz, thank you. Henry, thanks very much. Drew, if you were there, you have the floor, and thanks for making time.
Hey, thanks very much, and really enjoyed the article. Just want to make sure folks can hear me. Awesome. Just want to follow up on those points about federalism and a personal observation, or just to situate myself. I left in the last few weeks from being the chief operating officer of the state of Missouri. So I have a kind of operational perspective on what's going on maybe at a state level, or at least flyover state. Yeah, and one observation, one question. I would have a very different perspective on the plausibility of what was just proposed, of the idea of, for example, a rebalancing of federalism on things such as public health more towards the central government. I think the lesson that has been learned in many states, and I'm going to put quotation marks around lesson, it's analytic, I'm not advocating it, is actually that the central government failed so badly, and the CDC failed so badly that, in fact, it's much better to have much more fragmented, much more local control over things such as public health. And there's even legal action being taken to empower, for example, in my state, down to the local county level, political leaders to make public health judgments and overturn local public health authorities in doing so. So I just want to note that the sense of that the failure. So, hey, wouldn't it be logical if there's some kind of coherence? On the one hand, I would agree with that. On the other, I would just say that the lessons, in quotation marks again, lessons of the recent experience are leading a lot of people in the opposite direction. So just as an observation.
No, I think actually, what you say makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, you look at the CDC, it's not particularly, a victory lap of glory watching these people talk. It's disheartening. However, if physics is the same everywhere, virology probably is as well. And that what I think you're poking correctly at is it isn't just handing things over to the federal government. Got it. But for example, there is no way you can do tracing of syndromes without having a uniform information system across all 51 systems. We are not doing that. And that is nuts. I mean, it's an indictment to everybody. So what I think I meant to say, so I can be in sympathy with you and not look crazy as well, is we need to identify those things that really ought to be done centrally and get the CDC or whomever to actually do it on the one hand, but also
I'm having an audio issue. Can folks hear Henry?
Yeah, no, I don't hear him. Nope,
Henry.
he froze.
Okay, let's give him a moment to
Is this a lecture or a dialogue? What's the format?
The format is Q&A, and we'll go to additional rounds as soon as Henry is back. He may have to all
When is Q&A?
question and answer. All right.
Yeah, when?
When he comes back, I will continue to call on people for questions.
Yeah. And when he comes back, I do have one succinct, practical question for him.
Sure, just everybody hold on and be patient. And these tech glitches happen, and I suspect he'll be back momentarily.
Hate to think it's those scatterbots or whatever. That is worth seeing. If you haven't seen that video he talks about and makes reference to in the article, take a look at it. I think it's 7 minutes.
It is riveting, and you're right that if you click, Michelle has it in chat, click the article, then there's a link in the article to the relatively short video, and it's really quite striking. I'm looking at my email to see if and my text.
He came back in and then he just asked to come back in again. So he's working on it and he's here.
So everybody just stand by, relax.
What are those bots?
Scatterbots.
so.
Yeah, type that
I'm
in.
sorry.
I think you'll find a 7-minute video show up.
There you are, Henry. Welcome back.
All
And
right.
Drew has, you have the floor, Henry, but Drew may have a follow-up. But Henry, you first in any case.
Well, if you get the federal government actually working with the state because they
So thanks, Bailey Martin, for putting something in chat that you all were asking about. And bear with us. Bear with us.
So Fritz, I wanted to know more about these bots. What are they again?
There
Bots.
should be now from our colleague Bailey Martin, a link to a video that explains and illustrates
Thank you,
that.
because, thank you, Bailey. I used the wrong name. It's not scatter, slaughter bots. Thank you.
Yeah,
I see
there we
it.
go.
We showed that to a group of students. It got their attention. They paid very close attention to what was the discussion that day.
Yeah, it's pretty gripping. So let me, Patrick Chamrell, while we're waiting for Henry to rejoin, and we'll continue with the Q&A. Patrick, I have a question for you in these moments, if I may. Patrick from Stanford, our editorial board. Patrick, two questions. One is, so you're here and you're there. You live in the United States, but you have one foot on each side of the Atlantic, if that's a good way of putting it. I'm curious how this conversation sounds to European ears. I don't mean just you. I mean, as a European,
Yeah.
and insofar as you're acquainted, what kind of planning do countries like France and Britain and the UK do in these areas? But I can imagine some of my German friends finding this a little bit too science fiction oriented. Fritz, is that right? I don't know. I don't even know. Fritz, where are you from originally?
We're a Rhineland family, the
Okay.
Cologne area.
Okay.
Cologne.
So Patrick, simply, how do you hear this conversation? And insofar as you know, how do the French or other major European countries think about planning for such scenarios?
Well, that's a tricky question, but I believe that, size is a big factor. And so in Europe, given the size of all countries, it's very difficult to put so much emphasis on decentralization of security. So I don't think that we are in the same league as the United States just because of size. Maybe also because of culture and because of the fact that many European nations are more centralized than the United States. So that's all I can say. Just new questions to your own question, Jeff.
Patrick, bear with me. I'm trying to sort the tech issue. Just 1 second.
Okay.
Oh my. I thought we had mastered it. Can you hear me?
So there you are, Henry.
Oh, we're
just about to
losing
suggest
everyone.
Plan B, and there you are. So Henry,
Okay.
do
Yeah,
you
well, you
recall
can
where
see
we
that
left off?
maybe on this list of things to do, secure communications is a little bit higher on my priority list today.
All right. Do you recall where we were, Henry?
Who can remember?
Yeah. Drew, could you refocus and then please provide your follow-on question?
Sure. Just from the perspective of kind of the states, federalism, one quip back, though, I would say that there are some people who would disagree that there are laws of virology. At least I live in a state where a significant number of people don't even believe the virus exists. But putting that to the side for a second.
Yeah, well, that's not virology, that's psychology.
But putting that to the side for a second, in a very, very practical way, right now, because of the stimulus funding, state governments across the United States, and this is not an exaggeration, literally have more money than they know what to do with.
Yes.
And so, I mean, like, and for literally beyond the capacity to do the planning, to think it through. And the example I could provide from the state of Missouri is, one medium-sized state in the middle of the country, just for public health, has over $1 billion to spend on public health infrastructure.
Yes.
Okay, so just, if you think about that, one medium-sized state on public health, and there's a lot of other things, somewhere to the tune of, close to $10 billion plus or minus. So my question is very, very practically, because in a way, this is a unique opportunity, right, wrong, or otherwise, however you stand on the stimulus, that funding is moving out the door, so that it's a fact, right? So therefore, what would be some practical suggestions, if you have thought this through, of like what states should do with all this windfall that would potentially help on promote or advance on these areas?
My first suggestion is that they give it back. I mean, someone once approached my operation and said, what if we gave you, an enormous sum of money to hire this and this? What would you do? I said, I'd give it back. And they go, well, why? I said, I don't like staff meetings, and I can't imagine it's going to help me at all.
Yeah.
And I think here's a good instance where if you really wanted to send a message to Washington, that would be brilliant. But of course, they won't do it because human nature is not built to be that playful. So I think we have a problem created by the federal government here, to be blunt, because the checks and balances actually of government aren't all that much better at the local level, and they're getting worse because who the heck goes to City Hall anymore? You just give up. We could barely deal with our HOAs, for Christ's sake. So I think you've identified a problem, not a solution, but you should write something. The whole point of this piece was to get somebody else to do some work, not me.
So, Drew, thank you. Henry, can I ask you a question, which is, I don't know how to define it, but let's call it, at least in part, political speculative. I'm going back to your article about threats and threat scenarios. You mentioned in the piece January 6th. What, in your view, is the potential that domestic terrorism could rise to such a level, creating the kind of problems that you're concerned about?
You just need someone we had people with rifles in the 60s that did a lot of havoc, just a few bullets. Why is it any different today? You may not use a rifle because I think we figured out how to make that difficult, as an assassin's tool. But in a large state in India, they banned for a week the use of hobbyist drones because Modi, who runs the country, and it was not that popular in that place, was going to campaign for a week. Gives you some idea of what could happen here. So yeah, it's a big concern. Why wouldn't it? The means of doing the things we're talking about will be increasingly available, and they're not that easy to defend against yet. So, and this goes for not just drones, but the other things that come along. You got to be concerned about that. You bet. That's one of the reasons why you want the government to be, friendly and seen as a civic positive thing with as many citizens as possible. You do not want it somewhere in Washington. I mean, I go out to Delaware and they're bad-mouthing Washington as this obscure place that, you know, is all twisted. I said, you know, it's only 143 miles away. Have you been there? Well, then they admit they have. You don't want that if you're worried about what you've just raised.
Which makes me ask you, Fritz Heinzen, because you said tongue in cheek, I don't like your article because my words, not yours, you found it disturbing and alarming. Fritz, I wanted to ask you, how does one sort or balance or strike the right balance between alarmism, and none of us want that, and there are a number of national priorities and pressing ones right now, with strategic foresight and imagination about what can plausibly come? Could you share a thought or two about that? And then I'll tell you how I'd like to wrap this up.
This is where a president needs the best national security advisor they can get. There's gonna, in the end, it's gonna have to be one person with an office who can start to pull this together. And it's gonna have to, and that staff is gonna have to be first rate. They're gonna have to understand medical issues. They're gonna have to understand nuclear issues, proliferation issues. They're gonna have to understand why governments collapse, the energy, they have to understand energy issues, climate issues, and so on. It's going to have to require that. And then the problem is they're going to have to be able to talk to various cabinet members and others. It's sadly, you know, the US government is not set up necessarily for these types of situations. I mean, a constitution that was created when, what were your big threats? Yes, pandemics were a big threat back then. And yes, there was an overwhelming superpower in Britain and so on, but there weren't nuclear strikes and there weren't drones and there weren't things like, it is so complex, so difficult. You know, the case I often tell other students is just start with a very simple thing. Trade policy, a very simple issue, the Uyghurs. How do you help the Uyghurs without, in the process, depriving them of work, which is helping keep them alive, although in a terrible situation? American workers, workers in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and elsewhere, because it's all tied together. When you discuss trade policy or just textiles and apparel, let's say, you'll spend hours trying to unravel this. Now, take the whole, all these different things, which Henry has so nicely laid out in the article, despite my not liking it because it keeps me awake. Now what? It's just, the only thing you do is try to prioritize as best you can.
Well, let me throw an absolutely opposite rejoinder to that. I'm looking at your castle behind you, and I think, I don't know where it is. Is it in Germany? Where is
it's Hohenzollern Castle.
Right, close.
Yeah, sort of near Tübingen.
Let's just say we need to be less German on this question, number one. Number two, and what I mean by that is I don't think for a moment the folks at the founding and the Revolutionary War weren't faced with 1,000 complexities easily as stressful as anything we are, number one. Number two, it's just they had fewer means to deal with them. And we have so many. So I don't know that it was easier then. And I don't know that the Constitution, with its idea of pitting interest against interest, isn't on to something. I think actually the solution, to the extent there is one, is making people aware of the desirability of making things more survivable against a variety of threats. You're not going to get a neo-Kantian construct from the top down, but you'll do better. I think if you get out there more often, you distribute not only physically wealth and power, but also government officials even, I think you'll do better than we're doing. And it is not a financial question. As we can see, we have an embarrassment of money right now. And so I would not despair as much. The idea that we need another czar or a national security advisor to figure this out, let's just say, please spare me. I don't think that's reasonable.
Well, in a way, I agree with most of what you're saying. It's the first step, though. The first step to get this underway. What you're talking about down the road is totally logical and makes complete sense. It has to be an effort that is a broader base. It can't be just one person, but the initial step. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. That to me is the nightmare, the first step in it all.
Well, maybe you're just not aware that the first step's being taken.
Do you think there are steps being taken for EMP? That's my big nightmare scenario.
No. This, what I just told you, is classified thoughts only. It's not something that's Q clearance. I'm telling you, the first step is being taken as we speak.
Yeah, what is the first step, Henry?
Okay, so
Talking
hang on.
Talking
hang on.
about this is the first step.
So talking about this, steps are steps. And let me tell you that I thank Henry for being with us on a travel day for him. I thank all of you for being with us, because I know that you have more than a number of Zoom invitations and your time is valuable. The article was first published on June 18th. It is on the site of American Purpose. It is in chat, and what a terrific conversation. So, Henry, thank you. Safe travel. Everybody, thanks for joining today. Have a good afternoon, good day, okay?